Our journey into the fog begins with the entity, an almighty, malevolent being, traveling through the cosmos and slowly consuming worlds. It creates the nightmarish realms of the trial grounds to trap its victims, the survivors and the killers, in an endless cycle of trials, with the intent of feeding on its victim's strongest emotions, allowing it to grow in power and slowly consume another world. It is known to be one of the original ones, also known as an ancient. Our world's first encounter was described by one Benedict Baker, whom we will discuss in a later episode. The question you must ask is, why does this being do such horrible and vile things? The entity is the cosmic embodiment of evil, turning worlds inside out with its very presence. It corrupts its victims, slowly driving them towards madness, and eventually pushing them over the edge, which allows it to snatch them from their world and trap them in its realm. The entity travels from Terra world to Terra world, growing stronger in its power, until it eventually consumes all worlds in the cosmos. It is drawn to darker worlds, filled with chaos and darkness, as it chooses worlds that have failed to understand the metaphysical relationship between their thoughts and the world they live in, feeding off of their ignorance. Which brings us to the entity's Sustenance. The entity is described as an emotion vampire, with Sustenance coming in the form of strong emotions, such as the killer's rage and anger, or the survivor's desperation, hope, or even affection towards other survivors. The most effective way for the entity to procure these emotions is through the never-ending trials, invoking hope in survivors towards an escape from the nightmarish construct and fueling the killer's bloodlust in anticipation of the sacrifice, a bizarre ritual through which the entity extracts its sustenance, which it needs to magnify its power. With each passing death, a little bit of the survivor's soul is lost. Eventually, as all hope evaporates, the survivor becomes less and less useful to the entity, slowly devolving into a cold and emotionless shell. Those lost survivors, whose hope has long since left them, are eventually thrown into a limbo realm known as the Void. Survivors that are mortally wounded and die during the trial, or shortly after escaping, will be revived by the entity, also wiping their memories clean in the process, and relocating them back to the campfire, which brings us to the entity's forms and manifestations. The entity occasionally manifests itself in a physical form throughout the trial grounds, given certain circumstances. The two most common manifestations come in the form of spikes or spider legs. The spikes are used by the entity to block exit gates and windows, or to destroy pallets. The spider legs either shoot through the ground, piercing and killing any survivor that did not make it out of the trial grounds within the in-game collapse timer, or manifest themselves around the hook to eventually sacrifice a hooked survivor, and in case of a successful sacrifice, above the hook to transport the sacrificed survivor up into the sky to extract its sustenance from the sacrifice. The entity also has loyal servants in the form of crows, who let out screeching caws anytime a survivor even steps foot near them. The most effective way for the entity to get a foothold in a new Terra world is for it to corrupt its inhabitants to the point that they commit great atrocities as gruesome acts of violence, weakening the veil between the entity's realm and the world. Through this weak spot, the entity's realm begins seeping over into the world, allowing the entity to pull its first victims into its own nightmarish construct. These corrupted ones, also known as the killers, are then pushed to do the deeds that summoned this ancient evil in the first place. The killers are made to do the entity's bidding, which is to relentlessly hunt and kill the survivors. Many killers do not do so willingly, although some are happy to sate their bloodlust. Some have to be tortured over endless years to be coerced into doing what the entity wants. The entity is ever patient, and the torture ever more severe. Eventually, they all cave in and start the hunt for the entity. The entity actively recruits its killers by sensing their killing potential in their mortal selves, before corrupting them into committing violent or evil acts. It is possible for it to change its mind during the process of converting the human into a new killer and choosing someone else instead if it senses greater potential in them, as happened with Rin Yamaoka and her father, the latter having originally been chosen to become a killer. Prey for the entity comes in the form of the survivors, regular people who stumbled into the corrupted areas and were pulled through by the entity, with no memory of how it happened. Once they awaken by the campfire, even death is not an escape. The entity builds a reflection of the real world in its construct to confuse its victims. Unable, though, to really understand the true nature of the world it touches, it tries to replicate it as best it can, although it never quite gets it right. As a result, the world is an ever-changing nightmarish fusion of familiar and strange elements, as the entity makes up what it cannot comprehend. In this bizarre world, there are several familiar parts. The maps and their realms are based on the world it infects, and there are strange mechanical generators that the survivors can power up to open 2 exit gates. If they succeed, they will escape, although only back to the campfire that they started from. The realms respond to and change according to the entity's consciousness, and act as an expression of the entity's unconscious need for fear and terror. This is only the beginning of our journey into the fog. I hope you enjoyed the beginning of this long and unexpected journey. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, death is not an escape.